Like so many of us here today, I am an arts, cultural and non-profit evangelist. And I'm never more aware than when we come together to talk about culture that we do so here in Australia, from the lands of the oldest continuous culture in the world. And so it is with respect and with gratitude that I acknowledge the Jagera people of these lands we now know as Castlemaine, lands that have never been ceded, as well as First Nations elders, artists and storytellers here with us or listening. Specifically, my work and my heart is with the independent artists, practitioners and small to medium organisations who do so much with so little. So I'd also like to acknowledge all of you who are or who have been members of arts, cultural or other boards, councils or committees. Because in the machine of arts and not-for-profit governance, your work is both expected and required. We couldn't do it without you, and I mean that quite literally, because without boards, our organisations would not be allowed to exist. And that makes not-for-profit and cultural governance here in Australia as elsewhere an extraordinary act of institutionalised and mandated generosity. But it also makes it hard to critique that system without appearing to critique the generosity of the people within it. So please, I'll ask you all to take my respect for you and your work as read. I know that boards can and do good work, particularly within the parameters you've been given. But the data shows that you can and do also damage your organisations, your teams, your stakeholders and peers, without meaning to in most cases, certainly without ill intent, and often without knowing that this how the system we're part of lets us down. Over the last few years of my research in this area, I've kind of accidentally become a sort of sector therapist and spokesperson on this issue, which is quite hard for a lot of people to talk about because of the innate power dynamics involved. And so I'm afraid I am here today to tell you that nearly everything you thought you knew about boards and governance is wrong. And okay, so wrong is a harsh and finite word that I'm using to prove a point. So what I really mean when I say that everything you thought you knew about boards and governance is wrong is that a lot of it is firstly untrue. And yep, that's just another way of saying wrong, but there is a big difference between what boards think they need to do, what their legislation technically requires, and what organisations really need. To take just one example, in Australia we're usually told that we should have between 8 and 12-ish members on a not-for-profit board. And that might be what we've been taught is best, or at least common practice. It might even be a requirement of our operating rules or constitutions, which we can change. But most national or state legislation only requires between 3 to 5 board members, and 3 states don't have a minimum at all. The second thing I mean by wrong is inflexible, in that our organisation is obviously made up of organisations, our sector is obviously made up of organisations of all shapes and sizes, but with a few tiny variations, our laws impose almost identical, rigid and hierarchical structures that attempt to be all things to all organisations, and one size simply doesn't fit all. Wrong also means outdated and unfit for purpose, because not only was this inflexible model not designed for us in the first place, it was actually based on colonial, military and patriarchal structures that are often antithetical to our work. It's also not keeping pace with the ways that our context is changing or how our organisations need to respond to that change. Which means the vast majority of governance structures and expectations are also unnecessary. in that they come from common or unquestioned best practice, not legislation, not regulation, and are actually entirely optional. Fifth on my list of wrongness is that our current expectations are also unreasonable and hugely unfair, in that common practice governance currently tasks boards, unpaid or low-paid board members, with oversight, compliance, strategic direction and stewardship and duty of care and financial sustainability and fundraising and risk and crisis management and capacity building and being ambassadors for our organisations, and often a whole lot more. Which, as we've heard, is not only greatly unnecessary, but also unreasonable in expecting board members to have the time or skills to meet such a disparate and large number of obligations, and unfair in setting them up to fail. Not to mention also unexciting, stressful and shocking for some to find that board members are actively kept away from the parts of the organisation that usually attract them in the first place, or that being on a board can be, well, boring, or at worst overwhelm members into a kind of compliance-based panic. It's also unhelpful and unhealthy, because not only is the way much of the way things have always been done actually relatively new and not required for compliance, a lot of it isn't needed by our organisations either, which makes much of this work ineffective, counterintuitive and disrespectful to all those forced into unnecessary busy work, wasteful in keeping them from being more effective somewhere else, as well as kind of too busy doing the thing to think about how to do it better. Finally, it's unenforceable, because while boards may think they're doing things by the book, what book do they mean exactly? There are acres of advice on how to do good governance, but other than meeting legal or contractual requirements, of which there are fewer than we think, there is no one way, nor a single place where we can go for advice, arbitration or judgment. When things go wrong, we are on our own, including in this. And with all that's going on in the world, who has time to talk about how to do governance differently? If it's not broke, why fix it after all? To which the answer is, of course, because it is broken, and in so many different ways. Boards are being set up to fail, and board members with the best of intentions are doing more harm than good. It's also getting worse. Governance volunteerism was decreasing even before the pandemic, and since then, the actions of boards and the behaviour of board members are causing their organisations to lose credibility and even viability, making it even less likely that prospective board members are going to say yes when called, and risking us all running out of board members before we can change the system that requires them. It also doesn't have to be this way. And yes, unlearning and reimagining governance is going to take all of us, and it's going to take time. But being creative and being allies and champions for our organisations is what board members of arts, cultural and for-purpose organisations should do best.